Bill Gothard created a cult. There was behavior control, there was information control, there was thought control, there was emotional control, and this led to grooming of young women, undue control over every aspect of life, which is not Christianity. The gospel was lost.
Welcome to our live stream for beEmboldened. My name is Natasha Fish. I'm your board chair. I've got Kat, my vice chair, here today, which is a pleasure. And of course, Naomi, our founder and executive director. We are going to be talking about Happy Shiny People, the Duggar family and IBLP docuseries that has come out on Amazon Prime. And so if you've watched it, great. If you haven't, that's okay too. We're going to cover things about it that we find good to cover, good to talk about, good to bring to light, as well as answering your questions that you guys have. So please feel free to put questions in the chat at any point, and we will answer them as we go. But I'm super excited for this dynamic. Kat and Naomi, we always have some really good conversations. So welcome, you guys.
Thank you. I'm really glad we're going to be talking about this because this show is like trending on Amazon Prime. Like, I think it's one of their top shows, like for the second week or something.
Well, good. It's relevant. We definitely want to make sure we're talking about what's going on out there. Well, Naomi, why don't you start us off with a little bit more about why this is important? Not just the fact that it's popular, that Amazon Prime made a docuseries about it, but why does this matter and why are we talking about this today?
Well, I'd say for a couple reasons. First, because it is so public. And I mean, when we talk about the Duggar family, they were public for a very long time. This backs up for years. And so when any group is really public, that means a lot of people are going to watch the fallout and they're going to tune in and they're going to be curious about it and have questions. And I think sometimes, maybe project things or insert things versus leaving blanks. And so, all of that, I just think there can be some blanks that are left that people are wondering about. And not that we have the fillers for those. We don't, because I don't know this family. And I wasn't a part of this movement directly, though I know people who were. So I think it's important to address it for that reason. It's been very public. It's still very public. A lot of people are talking about it. So I appreciate different voices that are chiming in and discussing some of the issues that were presented. The other reason I think it's important is because there's overlap with, all of the groups that I'm familiar with, all of the different people that have come to beEmboldened from backgrounds, whether it was they had a mentor who was abusive, or they've lived in a compound, or they have experienced church hurt in a mainstream denomination. There's overlap in these themes that we're seeing in this docuseries. And so I think it's important to talk about the issues that we're seeing because, again, they're repeated over and over and over again across the globe. And so those are the two primary reasons where I wanted to get into this a bit with the two of you.
Great. Well, let's get into it. So let's start off. We all have watched it, so we'll start with that. But if you haven't, that's okay. You can find it on Amazon Prime. But as we were watching it, Kat and Naomi, did either of you watch the Duggar family show while it was airing on TLC? Do you have any memories of it?
I never watched it. I knew about it, like peripherally. I knew how popular it was, and I know TLC sort of, and I think they discussed this in the docuseries, has become sort of a, like, you're almost looking into the lives of people that are sort of maybe on the, I don't know if like fringes of society, or just like live a little differently than, the average person. And so, it's sort of like more of a spectator show on TLC. I think it used to be, they talked about how it used to be much more educational. But I think shows like this have really gained popularity because people are sort of in awe of, how are they having 20 kids or 19 kids, and counting. So obviously, I knew about it because it was super popular, but I had never watched it.
So I knew about it. I caught bits and pieces of it. I don't know if I ever watched an episode in fullness, but it was more of, if I was flipping or something and it was on and I'd pause for a few minutes. I had a very strong aversion to the show because I knew it was bad. And I could have been wrong. I'm saying I knew it was bad because it proved to be true. I could have been wrong, but in watching it, I just knew this isn't good. Like, there's bad stuff going on, and yes, that would be classic projection, potentially, but I recognize the similarities in my own family and my own situation, and I knew
Mhm.
this isn't all that there is to see here.
Mm.
I don't believe it. Basically, I was looking and I was thinking, I don't buy it because I don't see how this would actually be as good, as shiny and as happy as they were trying to portray it to
Mhm.
be. So it's just like, yeah, I don't buy it. And again, I could have been wrong, but I just couldn't buy into it. Like,
Mhm.
no. And so because of that, I didn't want to watch it. It was like watching some shined up version of my own life, and in a different way. Because I mean, we were polygamous and IBLP is not. So I'm not saying it's like direct, but just the legalism and the lifestyle and the pressures for perfection and some of that stuff. Just looking at it, I'm like, this isn't actually healthy. I don't believe that this is gonna work out where everybody's so chummy in the end. And I don't mean that flippantly. Like it just yeah, like, I can remember the feelings. What's kinda interesting about it is I didn't have the words for it. It was really an emotional response of I'm changing the channel. So this is more reflective because
Hmm.
of the words for it now as an adult and being where I'm at now, to be
Mhm.
able to look back and be like, "Yeah, that emotional response, this is what it meant." Was,
Mhm.
"No, this feels too familiar, and I don't believe that this is good."
Mhm. Yeah, it might have been like you said, too close to home. And I feel like how it was portrayed on TLC is like there's no arguing, no drama. It was sort of this mystical, idealized time. And they kind of break that down too, I think, in a good way in the documentary, where it's sort of like we love people that are viewing love seeing these sort of traditional gender roles because but also with that it's sort of non-existent in reality, but they like seeing these sort of prettied up versions of those gender roles. And every time that there was a birth or a wedding, and obviously there's going to be a lot of those when you're having that many, when you're having that many kids, like it's just the endless uh there's in perpetuation so many ratings that you can get from that. Like people love to tune in to those life events. And I think there's something like we all, very human about that. We like to see those kinds of things happening, and it feels like it's real. But again, like you said, Naomi, it's definitely a prettied up version, and it's not really accurate to what you experience. I mean, very similar to what you experienced, and so many other people that have gone through similar life things.
I mean, shined up is why they called it that, right? Because it's so there's something going on underneath that you don't find out about until later. I think of one of the examples in the show of one of the highest rated parts, right, was the wedding between Jill and her husband, and they talk about how on that day when all the chaos of filming a wedding on TV, they end up getting tricked into signing a contract that impacts them the rest of their
Yeah.
lives. And while everyone's watching the happy wedding, this stuff is going on behind the scenes that we don't find out about until later. It's disturbing to find that out later.
Hmm.
Yeah, and Natasha, I think you're right with how you phrased that. Someone who's seen the show might be thinking, "Well, it was a contract for 5 years," but it's continued to have impact because the contract was for 5 years, but then they were gonna potentially get a payout at some point. The
Hmm.
Jim Bob said he'd give a payout, but then they were gonna have to, like, give everything, and this is still a mess that is impacting the families' lives, and it's gonna continue, and I do feel like I know that from experience, and I do think I know that from hearing other people's stories. I mean, this is stuff that it's just a part of our story. It doesn't go away. So it can lose some of its impact in aspects, but it is life shaping.
I mean, they didn't, go into much detail on it, but it seemed to be that there isn't really any contact between Jill and her parents at this point. And I'm sure there's lots behind that. But just thinking about that one incident of being tricked to sign something, and then the what you mentioned later came of the payout that would come with a eternal contract. Just how those things were handled. It's like, how do you recover from that relationally? With your father
Hmm.
and your mother who have used you as free labor, even as an adult. It's mentioned that she didn't ever get paid, even though she was working on the show as an adult for 7 years as an adult, and never got paid. Like that's hard to come back from. And they show her being filmed pregnant, and those kids are not going to have relationship with their grandparents, assumedly. So yeah, it carries on. It impacts generations.
Yeah, and I felt like those coercive contracts reminded me a lot of trafficking, because with labor trafficking, we not only saw that with the IBLP, like using that labor basically for their event centers, right? But also with sort of the signature that they were, that they did for Jill, against her will, and when she was even an adult. And that's often how labor trafficking will happen, is these coercive contracts that you sort of sign thinking it's one thing, but you're not reading the fine print, or maybe don't have a legal understanding of what you're committing to, and then legally you are bound to that person. So yeah, I definitely saw the kind of that theme kind of crossing over into the exploitation of trafficking. I saw those similarities.
Absolutely. And Kat, that's part of why I wanted you here for this conversation, is because of your area of expertise being human trafficking. And there are definitely parallels, not only with the labor trafficking portion, but with the sex trafficking portion as well,
Absolutely.
with the grooming that occurred. So, I mean, I know we'll get to that, but yeah, I really appreciate your voice today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to join the conversation. And it is crazy, like how there is so much overlap. It's hard to put something in a category, like you were saying, Naomi. You're like, this wasn't my exact experience, but there was so much similarity to how you grew up as well.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, Kat. I think you mentioned this, and I think it's important to maybe frame it up before we just dive in and tear apart, all the people that were involved in this and what happened. But you mentioned, watching this show on TLC, there's something comforting, something appealing about that. And they talk about that in the docuseries, of like, we're drawn to these maybe standard gender roles that seem comforting to us. So I'd love for us to talk about, what can we learn from how the teachings of IBLP, which is the Institute for Biblical Life Principles, how those teachings appealed so deeply to people. And let's just explore the fact that really the people who got involved in that had reasons for wanting to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you go, Naomi.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think this is really the heart of this conversation for me, is IBLP. Unless really the Duggars were one family who were a part of it. There's still families who are part of it and continue to be influenced by it. And so while they are able to be used in a docuseries because of their history on television, to speak to it, which I'm so thankful for their willingness to step out and speak to it, because I know the very real losses and implications, and I don't know legally, that side of it, but the rest of it, the personal side of it, is very real. And so I want to be cautious for myself and in this conversation for speaking too much about their particular family, because I don't know their family. And so I want to be respectful of what has been out there, knowing that it's not the full story, and knowing that even what has been shared in the docuseries is not the wholeness of the story. So I want to be careful about the impressions I walked away from, because there's some things I saw where like it's upsetting to me, where I'm like, things are bothering me. I'm like, but I don't have all of the pieces. And so I want to be humble, in my review of those things, and remember that there's a lot to this dynamic, again, that we're not privy to. In regards to IBLP, because that came in partway through with the Duggars family, we really did see stuff change. We saw it worsen, and IBLP continued to grow and get massive and have all these training centers and all of that, as it's shown in the docuseries. And so it's, as far as the impact that it had within this series and what would have drawn people to it, and thinking about different time frames, I think we see this in every generation, that people are like, oh my goodness, the world continues to change. It's big, it's scary. It's, depending on the worldview can be like, this is the worst. It must be the end. This is it. It's never been this bad. And we forget Ecclesiastes. It says there's nothing new under the sun. And so, and every generation thinks this has got to be it. Jesus is coming back. This must be it, because it's never been this bad before. And it can be such a quick jump to instilling fear by a leader who is wanting to gain power. Like this is not a hard thing for someone to then capitalize on. And so it's going to draw people who are fearful of the times, fearful of what's going on culturally, what's going on politically, what's going on in the world, let alone on their own soil. And so it's like, oh my goodness, we're not wanting to be part of that. We see culture going this way, or we see politics going this way, and we don't want to be a part of that. We're scared, we're raising kids, we want to do everything right. And then it just gets capitalized on. It's like, yeah, you've got to do all these things. And then the gospel's thrown out. It's not the gospel anymore because the gospel doesn't have all the legalism. And so then it's like, well, now we're not actually, it's not even the true gospel anymore. And it keeps spiraling from there. But I think the appeal and why this happens, and I might be this is something that, again, I think I just have really been thinking about over the past couple of weeks after watching this docuseries. So I'm not going to say that there aren't other angles to it, but I think we can struggle with how simple the gospel is. And because of that, it is a lot, even though it's really more stressful to have a checklist, we can feel more assurance and having a checklist where we checked all the boxes than resting in grace and freedom in Christ. That can be more scary. And so I think that's part of the appeal of systems like this when they're created is, okay, I'm going to check these boxes and then I'm definitely good. It's definitely going to be okay. And there was the promise of protection with the umbrella of authority. There was a promise of like bad stuff's not going to happen to you. You're going to be protected. You're going to be safe. Your family's going to be safe. Your kids are all going to grow up and they're going to live good Christian lives. And so they're being fed all of these promises that aren't true. It's just, we can't count on that stuff. Like we can't, there aren't like magic tricks for this, like we don't get to live a system. It's not some equation of I'm going to do this and this, and then I'm promised this and this. And so, but I think it really speaks to the struggles that we can have and the fears that we can have. I think it touches a really deep place and it offers a counterfeit solution.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more, Naomi. I feel like, I keep thinking of like, in this world you will have trouble, but fear not, for I have overcome the world. So we're not promised in the Bible that we will not have trouble. And what IBLP is purporting is like, you have a problem, we have an answer. And so again, it's I think at the root of it, it's a lot of really well-intentioned people. Not only that, but I think that often people that have experienced some level of, which we all have, but like some level of intense trauma, I think are really drawn into certainty. So if you are coming from a traumatized background, your certainty and stability was probably ripped away, right? You're going to spend your life looking for that. And so that was really, that kind of stuck out to me too, is that I think that often, can you guys hear my thing going off? I'm so sorry. Okay, well, I'm trying to turn that off. Sorry, everybody. Next time that will be off. But I just wanted to say that, I think that often happens with people with that kind of a background is like, I want answers. I want specific and concrete how-tos of how to carry this. And kind of like you were saying, Naomi, it's hard to just accept, no, I'm held, I'm loved, and seen by God. Because it's almost like we want to earn it, and we want to almost like self-regulate ourselves, especially when we're looking for, maybe we've had trauma and we're looking for, again, that certainty. So to me, that was a really big reason as to why people were drawn in. And I think even just like, we will tell you exactly how to build this foundation into your children, and then nothing bad will happen to them. Like they will, but we saw that wasn't true, because a lot of them actually had a lot of issues that came as a result of being parented this way. So obviously that's just not realistic, but that's what the dream was. Like that's what was sold, I think, to the people that were drawn into it. So yeah, I really feel for them, because I think that's something we all want. I think that's something parents want. But we're not going to get that certainty in every aspect. That's why we have faith, and that's why we rely on Jesus. Because he'll be with us in those troubles, but we can't escape those troubles.
And for anyone who was a part of the movement or continues to be, where they were given these promises and the promises have not come to fruition, that is painful.
Mhm.
It's like, and they're faced with a really difficult choice. Either I'm gonna admit that it was untrue and it didn't actually quote unquote work,
Mm.
or I have to somehow reconcile this. And I mean, I gotta place blame somewhere. And if I'm not going to place it on the institution, on the leadership, on the system, and I don't want to take it myself, maybe some people do take it on themselves. Like, well, I could see a mom being like, well, maybe I wasn't as under the umbrella of my husband as I should have been. And I mean, so it starts to get really messy and undue shame and burden on people when really children get to grow up and make their own decisions. And, or someone, they're going to blame it on the kids, or they're going to like, it's got to go somewhere. And so
Right.
this gets reconciled in additionally harmful ways.
Mhm. Right. And I think too, what it created was sort of like you're saying, it's sort of like the blame's going to go somewhere, but it's going to go on the person who's not doing it and not submitting enough to their husband. There was a really good quote from an ex-member who said that you're so busy fearing that you're messing up in some way because there are so many rules, that you have no energy to question the system itself. So it keeps the system intact because you have no energy to even think, is this me? You always think it's yourself. You always think it's yourself who's causing the problem. So it protects that and keeps it going.
Right. Which is so normal, typical for high control environments.
Mhm.
Keep people tired, keep them tired, keep them having to shift, keep them, yeah. And they don't have the capacity and the clarity, the emotional energy, mental energy. Yeah. So it keeps them stuck.
Yeah. And I just had one more thought too, looking at my notes, like that umbrella of authority. I thought another reason a lot of people were brought in, or specifically men were brought in, I think IBLP was sort of there was a hierarchy. There was a way to find a position in which to advance. And, essentially like every father was sort of turned into a mini cult leader, it sounded like, and this was what they said in the documentary, and franchise spiritual abuse. And so that with that umbrella, Bill Gothard, the founder, is basically between God and everyone else. But then that umbrella is the men, did it say husbands, wives, or did it say men, women? I can't remember if it said husbands, wives, children. I think.
Husbands, wives, children. Yeah. So there's also the prioritization of marriage there. I have a feeling singledom is
Right.
frowned upon.
Right. Because I'm sure that's, even though that's the umbrella, I think it's probably taken as men are superior, right? Because I know that also they said whoever was in charge, and if there was an older male, whoever the oldest male was always in charge, and to put in a role of responsibility over everyone else. And so so I think again, men were able to find a position that they had respect and honor in, and of course, like they're going to be drawn into that. So I could see that being an attractive aspect as well.
Yeah, it would fuel pride for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But depending on how connected they were, wouldn't really have much power and control either. Like, not in reality, it's like this pseudo power and control, because really they're under the power and control of whomever they're under. So it's not even real. It's more of this perception.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we see is like, and people then exerting undue, excessive control then over whomever's under them in the umbrella. It's like this kind of acting out, taking it out, like, well, no, I'm going to take my power back by now over control, being excessive with whomever's under me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, go ahead.
Well, it's empowering. If there is it's sort of like the Stanford prison experiment where prisoners were pitted against each other, and they're all prisoners, but really some they told were, you're in charge of these other prisoners. And then they treated them just terribly. And it's, they quickly forgot, we're actually all in the same boat here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know some family stories where that was the case. I mean, the kids were treated awful. Now, I'm not speaking to the Duggars specifically. Again, like we know kind of what we know from the show, and then from what has been brought out. Now, the word like encouragement for spanking, I mean, that was
Whew.
That is so psychologically twisted. That is incredibly confusing. And that in and of itself is a huge problem. And so, yeah, when I heard that, it just made me feel sick. I'm like, oh my goodness, for this to be considered like it's encouragement to get be, and I don't know what that looked like, the details of it, but oh my goodness, just that word, that association. And how does that transfer to then view of God?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, this is encouraging to me when I get beat. This is,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not the a full right view of suffering in the world and why we suffer and who we suffer for. And the fact that we don't suffer alone and the fact that we have hope in our, it's an inaccurate depiction. And so that really hurt my heart when I heard that. And I was just thinking about psychologically how that would mess with you as you got older. And think about that, Cat, then in conjunction with the grooming
Mm-hmm.
that was reported for Gothard.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my obviously like alarm bells were really going off. Well, that was a really hard scene to watch. The little precious little boy that that guy who's kind of training everybody, like he said, I'm going to show you like encouragement. And my husband actually left the room. He couldn't watch that part, which, just so everyone knows, like it might be a lot for you. But even I just thought about abuse and grooming and how an abuser will really teach, like they will use language in a way that's very manipulative, and they will teach a child, let's say, if they're grooming a child, they'll teach that child language in a way that's different. So it might even look like a body part is not a vagina, it's a knee, right? So then that child is not empowered to then report. So they can never really, so as hard as it is for a child to report sexual abuse, an abuser will also take language and completely change it. So, oh, it was encouraging. And then let's also look at how our society viewed this family, for instance, or this, these really well-behaved children, which I think somebody said this in the docuseries, like who had been through it, who was an ex-member. She said, I saw these kids and I just thought, I know what it took to get there. And so we can see, like, I think it gives us a little glimpse as far as kind of changing that language from like it's a spanking, it's a punishment, to it's encouragement. Which, yeah, that again, psychologically over time, I mean, we kind of see some of those results, but that is literally what an abuser will do to help, to help the process along. And so a child will never really be able to report. It will be very difficult for them to do so, because it's already so confusing for them. So it's really drives me. I'm like angry talking about it because it's so satanic, so wrong. And, like you were saying, Naomi, it's like our savior, like that's so not the word encouragement. That's so not what that word means. We're not being punished. We're not being, and even that little boy who's being spanked, he said, give me a hug. And he's like, I could tell you didn't really mean that hug. It's like no physical. So they're being taught, like, do not have any physical boundaries. I mean, that was another thing you kind of saw with the Duggars that they talked about too, like with Josh.
Oh gosh. Well, and yeah, that clip that you're talking about with the little boy where he came up on stage and it's like bend over my lap.
Yeah.
First of all, did anyone else catch how long his hand just lingered on this stranger's child's bottom?
Weird. I know.
I mean, it's just like hung out there. It's like he didn't even like tap it and remove it. You just like tap, hold it. I'm like, you're just holding. This isn't your child. You don't know this little. You're just having your hand on his bottom. It's just lingering in between. It was very disturbing. And then, absolutely, that hug thing at the end. Oh my gosh, growing up, no matter how awful my dad had been that day. I mean, we get our heads banged into brick walls, and my brother got thrown off our bunk bed once into the wall, like on the other side of the room, and just like grabbed by our ears and pulled through the hallway, and just all kinds of things, just no matter what, we had to go in at night and knock on his door, which is a very terrifying thing. Knock on his door go into his room. He'd be sitting on his bed watching TV or listening to something or whatever, and we'd have to walk up to him while he's like sitting, he's not laying, he's like sitting up, like propped up, but
Mhm.
he's sitting there. So walk over to him, give him a hug, give him a kiss, say I love you, good night.
Mm.
There had been no reconciliation. There had been no acknowledgement of anything wrong. No, even you guys, stay with me for a second. In some horrific world where that behavior of his was actually acceptable and it was actually deserved, we still didn't even get like a "I forgive you, we're okay." You know what I mean? Like, and those precursors aren't there. But even if they were, so there's just nothing. It's just now we have to go in. I remember how awful that felt. And it was like, I have to do it or it's going to be worse for me. I have to now show signs of love and care for this person who has abused me. And so as I was watching that clip, it just like all came back and I could feel it of how awful it felt. Of like, give me a hug. Oh, I didn't really feel it. Like that wasn't really well, children have the right to not want to hug somebody.
Mhm.
And that is something we have been very strong in teaching our son. And even at times where I'm like, oh, when I know like, oh, it's been a long day, like mama could really use a hug. Like I don't say that to him. And I ask like, "Oh, can I get," like, if he's playing or something, like, "Oh, can I give you a hug, baby?" And sometimes he's like, "No, I'm playing." I'm like, "Okay." I go without because I'm a big girl and I can take care of myself in other ways. Like, that is not put on a child, and after they've been hurt, there was oh my gosh, yeah, no reconciliation conversation, no like, in every possible way, that
Mhm.
is messed up, and it is so deeply selfish.
Mm.
It is so arrogant and so selfish. Now give me something that I want. I have power and control over you. I just exerted that. And now you give me something that I want.
Mm.
It's sick. So yeah, that whole thing. And to see it, that was on a stage. How many families then modeled this? Who
Mhm.
knows?
Well, and the word that comes to my mind is transactional. Like it's basically transactional love, and they're teaching this like basically you need to show that you love God more. I remember he said that, and again, it's very like okay, if you do this, then so it's just again, it seems very like transactional. I guess I'm curious going off of that too, that scene, because I know there was some discussion in the docuseries of this religion or this community basically created little monsters, little boys that were perpetrators of sexual abuse. And of course, they did point to a few examples, right? Which I thought, I don't know if that goes back to what we were saying about, that umbrella. But that little boy, again, like it wasn't like he didn't have any power in that moment either. So maybe there was, again, it's like, well, I'm going to sort of assert my power because I don't feel power. So it's complex, right? Like it's not easy, but I don't know what you guys thought about that, but yeah, I thought it was just, they really, I felt like tried to drive that point home that it sounded like this was really where abuse was rampant. And from Bill Gothard, who was abusing girls, down to the Josh Duggar example that they really covered of his
Mm.
sisters, which I'm sure that there's abuse of boys too, but I guess that wasn't really something they talked about as much.
Yeah, Kat, I wondered about that too. About, boys, because we know that boys are trafficked. What's the percent? I think it's like 35% or something, if I
Yeah,
remember, is the estimate.
some estimates
Ugh.
are 30 to 40% are male victims. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I wonder how much of that has happened where it hasn't been spoken to. And in a patriarchal, authoritarian environment like that one, it would be potentially extra shameful for them to come forward. I think they would feel more like, "I can't because I'm a man and I'm a
Mhm.
boy and I should," and all of those are lies, like, none of that is true. But I
Mhm.
can see where that would be a burden they would potentially be carrying and feeling like they couldn't come forward, and so my heart aches for anyone that applies to, where they're like, I was supposed to be this, but this is what was done to me. And just
Mhm.
the struggle, I think, is exacerbated by that kind of theological environment. And again, I say that intentionally, theological environment, because all of this it's been tied to your
Mhm.
eternity. And that's
Mhm.
why religious abuse is so bad. The
Mhm.
religious abuse aspect of what is going on in IBLP is huge. It's all connected to religion. All
Mhm.
of it is. There's a religious context for all of these other forms of abuses, and it ups the ante
Mhm.
because it's then connected with your eternity. It's connected to
Mhm.
your salvation. And so that makes it more of a risk than it
Mhm.
would otherwise be. And it's already a huge feels so risky for people to speak out or to leave or to, but you add that to it. Oh my God.
Mhm.
It's so overwhelming.
Right. I mean, and I even like going back to the male victims, like with the Josh Duggar story. I mean, I did the question came to me like, what did he witness as a kid? Did he witness something that because I just this is my personal belief is that I think abuse is something that is taught and witnessed. I think it's something that I don't know that a child would know to do that. I mean, it's possible, but I kind of wondered, like, I think that it's a cycle and I think that it's passed along. So even just like as much as it's easy to want to point fingers at like, him as an individual, I think we can say that, yeah, this was something that he must have obviously like he witnessed his parents and his mother being very subservient. And we just don't know. We don't know the whole story there. So even though people want to demonize certain individuals, like, well, he's just an abuser. And yes, he should have been dealt with. And immediately when he was 12, and his parents kept it secret. But I kind of wondered, I was like, where did he see something and where did he learn to abuse his sisters? I mean, that was a thought I had. I mean, he's a victim in a way, I would say too.
There can absolutely be a combination there, right? And we hear that often, like people who were victimized who then become abusers.
Yeah. And
And
I
it
get
doesn't
that.
it
Mhm.
doesn't dismiss an adult being an abuser. Like it's not an excuse of like, well, I was victimized, so now I got to do this and I get off the hook. Like we would never say that. There can be more to the story though of how it
Mhm.
came to be. And I think something that stood out, I agree, Kat, with his story specifically, is that he didn't get the help and support that he should have gotten. So
Mhm.
there's some people where I hear their stories and I'm like, yeah, you still need to be held accountable for what you've done, but man, you didn't really have a shot.
Mhm.
Like, or you
Mhm.
didn't have a good shot at coming out of this in a good way
Mhm.
because everybody failed you left and right. And of course, again, we don't know the fullness of it all, but from what we can see in the docuseries, they failed him. And I
Yeah.
think the couple who were friends saw that, and that was where their hearts broke for it. Of like, they should have stepped in and helped. Even the police officer who then ended up in prison. It's like,
Mhm.
oh my goodness, like it failed at every turn. And so could it have been different? Maybe. I mean, we don't know.
Mhm.
We're not going to know that's it, but I would there's at least there's a possibility, had someone at 12,
Yeah. Well,
then
the guardrails weren't there, and in fact, like
Mhm.
he could have found any justification in the teachings, right? Like there's the justification for it, maybe.
Well, yeah, and talk about justification, that whole eye trap thing. Good Lord.
Mhm.
So that was, I don't know that any of us have come from some sort of like holiness background or a fundamentalist kind of background, which I want to come back to that term because of how that was used in the series. So I want to make sure that we have time to talk about how Christianity and fundamentalism were handled in the series. But anyone who has that sort of flavor in their background, like they have been taught some things about quote unquote eye trap. So I have not heard that term. I had not heard it used that way before. And have actual workbook pages where you're circling the potential eye traps on images where women are like 95% covered from head to toe. I mean,
Like they
but
got that at Chico's. I don't think it's
yeah,
not trap.
and I say it like,
Not if
oh
we're
my
scrappy.
goodness. But I get it because we were, taught to be
Mhm.
very, very covered and things like that. I'm hesitant to use the word modest because it was well beyond modest. It was legalism. But when the boys are hearing that, like, oh, it's teaching them that it's all on the girls. At
100%.
teaching them, oh, this is the girl's fault because there was an eye trap and I just can't help it. And so that, and we've heard this, you know, in other conversations about purity culture and things like that, but I just want to mention it. So these boys would grow up, and I'm not saying that they're not getting any teaching about their behavior. I don't know what that looks like for them. That wasn't reported in the series. And the people I know who have been through similar experiences with IBLP are all females. So I haven't really heard the male perspective connected with that specifically. I don't remember there being something specific from the male perspective in the series. But they're hearing, oh, well, I'm a male and so I struggle with my eyes. And so it's on her to avoid eye traps. Well, what does that set you up for? It sets you up for abuse. It sets you up for overpowering women and blaming it on them and saying that was their fault. And that's definitely the framework that I grew up into. Like it was going to be the woman's fault.
Yeah. I think, right. And I think we're trying to move away from that. Like, I mean, I think I kind of grew up in a similar, I remember being taught that when I was maybe at church or maybe going on a mission trip, like you need to dress modestly. It's your Christian brothers. And I literally remember thinking like, if they're my brothers, why are they looking at me with lust, you know? And so it just didn't really make sense. I remember, but I felt like, I don't know, for those of us who have seen like Keep Sweet, Pray, Obey, I felt like there was a total parallel, and this is probably just very similar to, and even one documentary I'd seen about NXIVM, the cult. It's like controlling women's bodies and also their appearance, and even I think it goes back to the quote, you know, sort of the cult leader or cult head, Bill Gothard, who's kind of prescribing that women have this like soft. It's a specific hairstyle. It's very like I think seen as feminine. It's like a very soft, curly. Longer hair. And that's something you literally see in, you know, all the Duggar women and all these women trying to, you know, take on this physical appearance. You know, one ex-member said, Bill Gothard looked at me and said, your hair's not curly enough, you know, and just this very specific sort of idealized woman. So I thought that was really interesting. It's like those it's little, but not little forms of control of women. And again, it goes back to, they're so focused on, is my hair curly enough? So they're not looking at this huge like system of power and control that's dictating everything in their lives.
Right. They're trying to hit the metrics. They're trying to protect themselves, stay safe within the system, survive it,
right,
and hopefully make it to heaven.
Yeah, right. And, you know, I was also struck by the fact that, you know, Josh Duggar's wife, Anna, it's like something that you're taught as a woman too. It's like loyalty, or what was it? I got to find the quote. Wives are taught that loyalty is proven through adversity. So when would you ever leave an abusive situation, right? Like as a woman either,
right. Never.
If you're proving that your loyalty, which is a virtue. And ultimately you're right. Like, because God's at the top of that umbrella, if you're proving it to your husband, you're ultimately proving it to God.
Wow. So we've talked about several harmful teachings of the IBLP and how those are misconstrued, how things are taken from scripture or theology to validate or justify those things. And Naomi, you mentioned wanting to talk about how Christianity and fundamentalism was talked about in the docuseries. So yeah, how was that portrayed and what does that tell us?
So Kat, I'm curious to hear what you think too. I think I did not think that it was accurate. I didn't think that the words were used accurately. I think it was semi-used interchangeably, you know, terms were kind of used interchangeably. And I understand that different people who are coming on, they're going to have different, you know, their own perspective of how they would classify. And some people would use a term and not necessarily really know how they're using it versus how, you know, so I'm not saying this to like criticize any individuals that came on the show. I think anyone who came on there who was a victim, we need to give lots of grace for how anything was phrased or because I know what it's like to sit with a camera on you and speak about not only your trauma, but something that is going to be like the one gentleman who came on. I wish I could remember his name. Please forgive me for not recalling at this moment, but who said this is basically the nail in the coffin. You know, no one's talking to me because I'm coming on the show. That wasn't a joke. That was true. And so for anyone who's looking at it and is kind of being, seeing those aspects and thinking, well, I didn't like that or I didn't like this, please leave room that having those cameras and those lights on you and knowing what's going to happen because you're doing that interview and the risk that you're taking. And sometimes it's very real safety issues. The woman who shared about how she got out before she likely got shot along with her children. I mean, these can be very hostile, aggressive groups where lives can actually be in danger. So I want to preface with that. I think we need to leave room for anyone who was a victim who came on and spoke. In general, I don't think I think Christianity was used, again, kind of interchangeably, and so not really accurately at times of what Christianity actually is. So I would say, from what I gathered anyway, and so again, take this with a grain of salt. This is what I gathered from the docuseries. I did not fully watch the show growing up, as I mentioned at the beginning of this live stream. It seemed like the Duggars, as our example, were likely more of a fundamentalist type Christian in the beginning. But then once the IBLP and the ATI situation happened, we moved away from that and we moved into cult territory. So there was a transition that happened. And I think, again, in the show, that was blurred and a distinction wasn't made. And I think there should have been one. I would have appreciated there having been one. I think it put Christianity in a light that is inaccurate. And I'm not saying like, oh, it put it in a poor light. I mean, some people are going to put it in a poor light anyway because they're not going to choose Christianity. I care about accuracy, and if the accuracy is poor, then so be it. But I care about accuracy, and I don't think it was accurate to be using Christianity in some of the ways in which it was being used. Fundamentalist. There's some ambiguity, I think, even within Christianity right now as to what is fundamentalism. So I did go back to, okay, what is an actual definition of fundamentalism, like dictionary definition? I think that's a good place for us to always just start. And then, of course, we have to bring in historical and things like that. But so briefly, I just want to say the definition of fundamentalism is a form of religion that upholds belief in the strict, literal interpretation of Scripture. The second definition option is strict adherence to the basic principles of any subject or discipline. So, and I see kind of a mix here of like, okay, strict adherence to the basic principles as taken literally in Scripture. So when I think of fundamentalism, I would think of like the holiness movement. I would think about the interpretation of women not dressing like men, which is such a cultural thing. I'm like, men wear skirts in some countries, and they did actually at the time that was written. So, or more like dress style skirts. So it's like, okay, what does this actually mean? But if the interpretation is, okay, women are, like, I'm taking it very literally. I don't think they take it literally properly because there's cherry picking. So there's cherry picking, there's a lack of historical context. So the literary exegesis that's happening is very poor. And so I'm like, I struggle to even say fundamentalism is actually the fundamentals because I think that there's been misinterpretation of Scripture and misapplication. So I wouldn't agree that it's actually the fundamentals of Christianity. Where did the gospel go in this docuseries? That's fundamental to Christianity. Mm-hmm. So we've got some terms here that are big hitter terms that are being used in a really muddled way where I think people would watch the show and walk away thinking things are fundamental to Christianity that are not Christian, and that things are just flat out Christian that aren't Christian. And so I'm like, this was inaccurate in its portrayal as far as how these, again, big hitter important terms were used. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to speak to that for this live stream because I know it's been unsettling for many, and I've seen a lot of feedback and comments and things like that about how the terms were used. And so for something like the way they were living, I would say they had some of those holiness standards that we would see in like UPC, we'd see in Brenhamism, and in these different groups that are out there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Bill Gothard created a cult. There was behavior control, there was information control, there was thought control, there was emotional control, and this led to grooming of young women, undue control over every aspect of life, which is not Christianity. The gospel was lost. I mean, they're trying to create an army. They're taking kids away from their families at young ages, like 14, and having them live in headquarters. I mean, this was a mess. This was seeped in a mess. And that is not Christianity. And that's not the fundamental of Christianity. And so we needed to use a proper term. And again, I say that with full grace to our victim survivors who are out there speaking. But big picture, as far as the team that created the show and all of that, and I'm like, I don't even know that they would have been equipped to have done it differently, because we didn't have like experts in Christianity. We didn't have scholars as a part of the show or anything to help navigate those things. I was just listening to a different interview this morning where I'm like, these people probably shouldn't be talking about this topic. I think it's too far outside of their wheelhouse. And they're just stepping and stuff all over the place. And I'm like holding my breath, like, oh my gosh, they just said that, you know, but they're trying. And so I think also having humility in what our areas of expertise are and being willing to state that. Again, we're looking at Amazon Prime, we're looking at, you know, so it's like, just realistically, I'm not surprised by what I saw. I'm not mad at everybody for it. I think it was a disservice. I think there were inaccuracies, and I'm disappointed that that happened, because it's not the message I would want to share. I would not want someone trying to be recruited by a cult and thinking that's Christianity, because it's just flat out inaccurate. Like, let's go with accuracy. That's what we're talking about, right? That's why this group is so problematic, is because of all the things that are wrong. Like, in us talking about something that was wrong, let's not talk about it wrongly.
Mic drop.
Seriously.
I mean, that I think is a great way to summarize it. And I hope everyone watches to the end of this, because I don't think there's a better way to say it, Naomi.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot more we could dig into here. We could spend a whole series talking about everything that happened in the docuseries, but we hope this is a good way to just think about what you are seeing out there. I would definitely recommend go back to our December live stream between Kat and Naomi, and we're just talking about this content that's being put out there on streaming services. Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. There's lots of documentaries that are going out right now. Just to be thoughtful and critical in your watching of them, your habits of binging, or watching during the day, watching with someone, and what the responsibility of that content and watching it does have as you share it with other people, or just take it in yourself, and thinking about who's putting it out there, and what the editing team can do to control what messages are shared, and what just recognizing everyone has a bias and everyone has an agenda. And so I think it's really important to think about those things, and that's how I'd like to leave you all with that as we talk about this topic, and maybe we'll dive into some more future topics about specific docuseries.